Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 221 on an important topic, the sustainability of the tuition loan system in England, which is on something of a knife edge at the moment, as you'll hear. Before I introduce our two speakers, I'm going to take you through the webinar protocols. Remember that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website within the next 48 hours or so. We're finding that the YouTube viewings are exceeding the participation during the live webinar itself now. A transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted on the CG website. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar, unless you've been asked to speak or you've got to the point of asking a question during the Q&A. There's no need to have your video on either during the webinar, but please do so when you're asking your question. We recommend using the speaker view setting in Zoom in the top right corner so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given time. Now, to ask a question, use the chat function. Type out your question there. If you want to make a statement rather than ask a question, also indicate in the chat function. And I'll compose the Q&A list on the basis of what's coming through in the chat. So the earlier you make your comment and the more relevant it is to the topic of the webinar, the more likely it is to be included in the Q&A process. When you're invited to ask your question, and I will give you a warning in the chat before that, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce two speakers today. The substantive paper will be given by Nick Hillman. Nick Hillman is the director of HEPI, and he's been the director of HEPI, Higher Education Policy Institute, since 2014. He formerly worked for the Right Honourable David Willetts MP, as he was now Lord Willetts, who was an influential and important Minister for Universities and Science from 2007 until the end of 2013. And Nick was Chief of Staff and then Special Advisor later on to the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. And as HEPI Director, I think he's carved out a very considerable role in relation to public discussion of policy issues in the sector. Nick's substantive paper will be commented first by Professor Lorraine Dearden. Lorraine is a valued colleague in CG, a professor of economics at UCL Institute of Education, also affiliated to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and has been an active researcher on our projects with particular focus on the tuition loans structure and its usefulness around the world. At this point, I'm delighted to hand over to Nick.
Well, thanks so much, Simon. It's a huge pleasure to be here, to be doing another one of these. I often listen into them as a punter and really enjoy them. So I know how valuable they are, and I'm grateful to you and indeed to Trevor for help with our own webinars. So I'll set a timer for 25 minutes so that I don't go over, and so that Lorraine's got time to speak and people have time to respond, because I know you have a stellar audience of experts. For those of you who don't know, I mean, Simon, I'll do this bit very briefly. Simon just introduced HEPI. For those of you who don't know HEPI, we're the UK's only specialist think tank on higher education. There are other think tanks, more famous think tanks, bigger think tanks. There aren't others that are specialist only in higher education. We're supported financially. We're very open about this, predominantly by universities, most universities up and down the UK, and also a small number of corporates. But we are a charity, and we're accountable, therefore, to trustees and Charities Commission and other people like that. And we're probably most well known for a stream of publications. We look for topics that we think other people aren't talking about enough, or they're talking about in a way that perhaps they have to talk about it like that because maybe they're a lobby group, for example, whereas we have the freedom that comes with being a charity to range a bit more widely. I won't talk about all these reports here, but you just see the range of topics we cover, from student accommodation to universities' responsibilities in relation to climate change, to how media are covered how the universities are covered in the media, how students survive during coronavirus, that sort of thing. We got lots of press coverage the other day for a report we did on students' personal lives, including their sex lives. And we looked at that issue, not to be prurient or tabloidish, but because the existing evidence base on this issue is woeful. I mean, it's really, really bad. And so we did a poll that hopefully improves the evidence base, not perfect, but a poll of 1,000 students and asked them all sorts of things, including showing evidence that they didn't think they'd had great sex and relationship education before reaching university, and they thought their universities had a duty to improve their education on things like consent. And then the other thing you might have read about us in the last week was we published our biggest thing that we do each year last week, called the Student Academic Experience Survey. I've actually presented on earlier years' findings to this webinar series before, but it was a profoundly important one in the series that goes back 15 years because, of course, it captures the nature of the student experience during COVID times, and it shows that students, this chart is for all students in the UK, international, home, whatever. Overall, they think they're getting poor value for money, nearly half, and only around a quarter think they're getting good value for money, which is really shows in, I think, a very profound way the impact of the pandemic on the teaching and learning experience, but also the wider student experience. And we do a blog. If you're not signed up to it, do have a look. I mean, today's blog is a review by me of the new Adrian Woolridge book on meritocracy that I think is a very important contribution to the debate about the right balance between academic routes and other routes, you know, sometimes called vocational and technical routes. But Simon asked me specifically to address this session on a report that we published earlier this month on student finance and particularly the tuition fee regime as it exists in England, and also actually the maintenance regime, because for those people who are listening in from other countries who may or may not know, your typical English undergraduate is expected to borrow £9,250 per year for their education. And then on top of that, maybe a similar sum, it's means tested, but maybe a similar sum for their living costs. So they can easily end up after 3 years of study, once you add interest on top of that, with a debt of, you know, £50,000 or pounds, or even north of £50,000. And so we published a report looking at the parameters of the student loan system, and the current system is based on what was introduced in 2012 when I was working for David Willett, as Simon says, although the underlying legislation is actually older than that. It goes back to Tony Blair's time as Prime Minister and the 2004 Higher Education Act. So, so let me take you through the report. It's a very short report. It was only 6 pages long, so it doesn't go into enormous detail. But the report starts by saying, look, in a crisis, you shouldn't cut spending on education. At a time where opportunities for young people are constrained, when the labour market and employers are changing fast and looking for the sorts of transferable skills graduates can bring, and when the wider economy is changing, plus, which is the case in England, very much so, the number of 18-year-olds is growing, which is happening now in the UK. After 10 years of decline, we've now got 10 years of growth in the number of school leavers, and a higher proportion of them want to go to higher education. We say when you put all those things together, you just shouldn't cut spending on education in a crisis. And we emphasize that argument by looking at the benefits that education, particularly higher education, can deliver, which I like to think of, this is not an original thought, but I like to think of as a quadrant, because that captures both the individual financial benefits and the benefits to society in financial terms, like extra tax payments, but also the non-financial benefits to both the individual, better health, for example, more likely to be engaged in civic life, and the non-financial benefits to society as well. And you can see all of those on this chart. These aren't just random things that I've plucked out of thin air because they make the higher education sector and the sector that ultimately pays my wages look good. They are all claims that have a substantial academic evidence base beneath them, mainly from the UK and also the US. So I think it's important to say that, because many people have interpreted the report we put out as saying taxpayer funding of higher education should be drastically cut. That is not what we've said. What we said is higher education, particularly in a time of economic difficulty, is something worth financing properly. So that's the initial conclusion. But look, let's get real. We live in an environment where the government is borrowing a lot of money, spending a lot more money than it's getting in taxes, and in which the government is rather down on a lot of things that our sector does. So Gavin Williamson, who, particularly for those people outside the UK, is our Secretary of State for Education, has gone on the record as saying he thinks some British universities, particularly English, because he's only got responsibility for teaching in English universities, run dead-end courses, his quote, not mine. He's also gone on the record saying he opposes the target that the Labour government before 2010 had to get more than 50% of young people into higher education. He says he opposes that. Given that we have already surpassed that target, and the way the number is calculated, more than half of young people now go to higher education in the UK. If you oppose that target, that is equivalent to saying you think fewer people than currently go should go. In other words, some people are going to higher education who you as the government believe should not be going. And the third article there is a piece by a very well-informed journalist who's married to one of the Prime Minister's spokespeople about why the government thinks the way it does. And it's well worth reading. You can probably just about see the date there. It's from earlier this month in the Times, and it's available online. So although it is absolutely, I mean, HEPI is a non-partisan charity anyway. We don't take lobbies, we don't lobby for particular positions. But as I say, my personal view is we shouldn't cut spending on education in a crisis. But the idea the government is not looking at that, is wrong. The government absolutely are looking at that. They think probably ever since the financial crisis of 2008-9, higher education has had too much of the spoils in terms of education spending and other elements of our education system, particularly our further education colleges, which do deliver some higher education, but also deliver other things, sometimes bracketed in as vocational, have not been funded sufficiently well. So that was the starting point for the bit of work. And then we said, look, there are three ways that you can save money on higher education spending. The first way is you have, you spend less money per student. So the amount of money coming to universities, however it comes, whether it's loans or grants or whatever, you just have less of it. So universities have to get by on less money per student. Another way is you just have fewer students. Or a third way, which is the meat of our report, is you actually expect students as graduates after they've left study to pay back a higher contribution than they are otherwise expected to do. Let's just take those in turn very quickly. The reason I think it is absurd to think, in my personal view, that we should have fewer students as a way of saving money is partly, as I said before, the number of 18-year-olds is growing now for 10 years. Ask any teacher in the UK and they've seen the bulge go through their schools, so they're very well aware of this. Actually, though, in higher education demand terms, it's not the raw number of 18-year-olds that's the most important point. It's the proportion of however many 18-year-olds there are who are sufficiently well qualified, have the desire and the aptitude to go to higher education. And that's been rising, as you see on the right-hand chart here, for a long time. And it would, you know, it goes way beyond earlier than this chart as well. So the post-war trend, really. So I think cutting student places would be an absurd thing to do. We've published a report modelling future demand that suggests, in fact, we need 350,000 extra full-time university places just in England by 2035. That's not 350,000 what we would call freshers, you know, first years. It's the stock, it's the first years, second, third years, fourth years all added up. But nonetheless, it's a very significant number and would, you know, equivalent to many new universities. And also, by the way, if you ask mothers of young children, as they've done in the Millennium Cohort Study, do you want your child to go to university? 97% of them say they do. So I don't see, if you're committed to saving money on higher education, I don't think cutting the number of places is serious politics. The government does. I don't think it is, and we might want to return to that in questions. So the second thing you can do is cut the spending per student. And this chart shows how much money universities have had to educate home students, not international students, in constant prices in recent times. And it's bounced around. It went up when Tony Blair introduced £3,000 tuition fees in 2006. Then it drifted down again. Then it went up again when the coalition government introduced £9,000 in 2012. Then it was flat, and it's drifting down now because since £9,000 tuition fees were introduced in 2012, they've only gone up once, and that's just by £250. And we're waiting, of course, for the government's response to the Auger report, an independent review of all our post-compulsory education system. And the Auger report said reduce tuition fees, but actually the government should make up the gap. Reduce tuition fees to £7,500, and actually the government should make up the gap. But even, I don't think the government ever would make up the gap, but even the best reading of the Auger report said in real terms, the amount of money universities get to educate each student should drift down, which equates to an 11% cut by 2022, 2023. So universities are going to have to get by on less money per student anyway. The other thing is, of course, the government's very keen to attack specific courses. Lots of headlines there showing how they think some degrees are not worth the paper they're written on. The problem with that is however you measure the quality of a course, it's flawed. You know, if you do it on student satisfaction, well, we all know some academics do better because they look prettier or something, or, you know, there's some other biases in there. You know, we all know the teaching excellence framework, which is the English way of measuring teaching quality, is flawed. We all know graduate earnings is a flawed measure. So it's very easy to say there are courses that are not good enough and shouldn't be run. It's very hard to actually say which ones they are. And then there used to be a fourth way to cut spending on higher education, which is you shifted things that were classified as grants to universities or students and made them loans. And the way that we in the UK used to account for student loans is that every single penny you loaned out to students disappeared from the public accounts for in-year current spending. But you can't do that anymore because the write-off costs of the loan, the amount of the loan that we expect will never be repaid, has gone north of 50%. And the accountants have said, you just got to include this in your current public spending figures. So the idea that we can convert even more stuff into loans, that's been exhausted. So the meat of our report looked at the options. And what you have on the chart in front of you here is the current repayment terms. So as I said at the start, we expect students to borrow money for their tuition and their maintenance, and they can easily leave university with £50,000 worth of debt. And then we expect them to pay it back. and we expect them to pay back a 9% of their salary above about £27,000. So you don't pay anything at all on the first £27,000, but above that, you pay 9% of your salary. The impact of this is that women, because there's a graduate gender pay gap, partly because of the professions that are female dominated, tend not to be so well paid, partly because women more than men take time out to raise children or to work part-time, etc., etc. You know the arguments probably better than me, but women pay back a lot less than men. And in fact, the first 4 deciles among the supposed repayers among women don't pay back any money. That's because they never get to that £27,000 repayment. Men are less likely to repay nothing, and the very highest earning men actually pay back slightly more than they borrowed, because there's an interest rate for high payers on the outstanding loan. And you add that all that up, and what it means is the government are paying per cohort, so it equates really to an annual figure, £5.4 billion a year on tuition fee loan write-offs and £4 billion a year on living cost loan write-offs. So, you know, getting on for £10 billion a year for a system that was meant to have shoved the costs off the backs of taxpayers onto the backs of graduates. And the RAB charge is the proportion of the loan book that's expected never to be repaid. So as I say, people think that England has a high tuition fee and loan system and that graduates are mainly paying for the cost of their education, but actually taxpayers are still picking up more than half of the money that is supposedly loaned out. And that is very different to what it was meant to happen. So yesterday I was in my office in Oxford and I was clearing out some old papers, and fortuitously I found an old paper by Lorraine, who's going to respond in a moment, published in 2012, that showed what the repayments, according to Lorraine's calculations, for the system we have were meant to be. And you can see that in Lorraine's calculations back in 2012, everybody, even the people in the lowest paid graduate deciles, were meant to be repaying back some of their debt. These numbers are not directly comparable with the other numbers because they're in 2012 money, not 2020 money, but nonetheless, you can see the trend here. And in fact, when you put the two charts side by side, as I say, it's not a straight comparison. So all the intelligent academics on the call probably wouldn't regard this as a serious comparison, but I think it is instructive because it shows what we've got, which is quite a lot of graduates not repaying a single penny versus what we were meant to have. And it also shows a huge gap between men and women. That's partly a function of the data. I suspect Lorraine's data was less good back in 2012 than the data we have now. But nonetheless, you can see, in short, the system is not working how it was meant to work. That is the truth. How the government back in 2012 thought it was going to work. And part of that is a consequence of policy change. So bottom right there is a reference to Theresa May as Prime Minister increasing the repayment threshold by a lot, from 21,000 to 27,000, well, 25,000, and it's since gone up to 27,000, which meant a lot less money coming back in. And some of it is a consequence, some of the increase in the write-off guesstimate is a consequence that the data's got better. And you can see top left there, I was quoted in the newspaper saying, when I'd worked in government, we'd got the maths wrong. So we looked at the options. And you can see here on this chart the various options. So the first thing is the current system. As I say, that costs close to £10 billion a year in write-off costs. The write-off percentage is 54%. 88% of students, nearly all former students, don't repay the whole of their loan off. And a third, 33%, don't repay any of their loan off, even though the average debt is £47,000. And so the first thing we modelled actually is something we would have a cost to government, not a saving to government. But we did it because there's a former universities minister, Chris Skidmore, going round saying we should get rid of the real interest rate on loans. He said middle classes don't like the fact that there's an interest rate applied to their loans, which is it's tapered in, but it's a maximum of 3% plus inflation. So it's currently 5.6%. It's pretty high. So the first thing we modeled was actually getting rid of the real interest rate. And obviously that puts the costs to government even higher, because the people who do pay off the whole of their loan benefit from a lower interest rate. It's not really worth dwelling on, because however much former universities ministers might like the government to do that, they're not going to do it in the current fiscal environment. So we then looked at the possibility of extending the student loan repayment term. The Auger report that I referred to suggested we should extend the student loan repayment term from 30 years to 40 years. We didn't model that. We modeled 35 years. That saves you £1 billion a year of public money. It only reduces your write-off cost to 50%. And as you see, it hits typical graduates by slightly increasing their repayments, because they go on paying back for 5 years longer. Even 35 years is short compared to some countries, of course, because some countries you just keep on paying even if you've retired until your debt is extinguished or until you die. And then the one that got the headlines was this: reducing the repayment threshold from £27,000 down to around £20,000. The number we chose was not random. It was the old threshold. It's the threshold that is used by people who went to university before 2012. So this is a threshold that's already in the system. And if you reduce the repayment threshold back to about £20,000, you save British taxpayers about £4 billion a year. The write-off percentage of the loan book gets back to a third, which was the original policy intention. But look, it affects men and women. They both pay back, on average around £10,000 in total more. But obviously that's only an average. So it affects, the very poorest still don't repay anything, because they never earn £20,000 or just under £20,000. And you can see, but the percentage not repaying all their loan is still around 3/4, but the percentage not repaying any of their loan falls to 16%. So I'm not claiming this is a particularly politically attractive idea. It would be very hard, I think, to tell 20-something graduates who are struggling to get on the housing ladder, who are finding it not always easy to get graduate level jobs, that the student loan terms are retrospectively changing. However, my personal view is it is better than some of the alternatives, certainly better than cutting student places would be, and certainly better than making universities so financially unsustainable that some of them go to the wall. I also, just last night, had a look at how our current student loan repayment terms compare to those in other countries. Simon will be among those of you who know these other systems better than I do. That's my 25 minutes up. So this is my penultimate slide. So I'm about to stop. And actually our repayment terms are quite different to those in other countries. So our repayment threshold of £27,000 is higher, slightly higher than Australia, much higher than New Zealand. Our repayment rate of 9% is very different to the way the Australian one works. The top repayment percentage in Australia is 9%. Again, it's even higher in New Zealand at 12%. And our repayment term is fixed to 30 years, where my understanding is neither Australia nor New Zealand limit the repayment term. But we have a higher interest rate. So the maximum interest rate, which is only on high earners and also students while they're studying, is currently 5.6%. So your loan can go up faster than you're able to repay it. And then my very final slide is just a reminder that HEPI is not a lobby group. We're not lobbying for a change to the repayment threshold. We publish all interesting ideas in this space. And we published another paper back in January that called for the entire student loan system to be ripped up and replaced by something that looks much more like a graduate tax. And I thought it was just important to remind people, unlike the CGHE, we're a broad church, and keen to just make sure there's a healthy debate in this space, which I know Lorraine will now deliver as well. Thank you.
Lorraine.
Yep, I'll just share my screen. So can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yep, great. Okay, so I'm going to be quite brief, and I just want to say I agree with most of what Nick has put forward today. You know, the financial costs and ICL design needs to be reconsidered given the current context. And I think particularly with the wish to extend loans to the vocational sector, it really means that we have to go back and redesign our ICL system, because it was designed for people going to university with typical earnings of university graduates. I think one of the most important policy reforms is to extend the system right across the board to all post-school education, full-time education, part-time education, to make the system much more neutral and to design an ICL that will work right across the board. And that might encourage some people who are currently going to university, just because the upfront support is so much more generous, to actually pursue vocational routes which are cheaper for the government and students if they have upfront support to do their vocational education. But I would argue that some of the analysis is not quite right, and you really need to look at the distributional implications of what Nick is proposing more closely. And I think it is what is driving his agenda, you know, the results he showed and the results he showed from the IFS, is that I think we do our earnings simulations much better. It is very clear from the simulations based on the London economics model that there's not allowing for proper labour market mobility that we observe in the labour market. We know, I've had access to the actual loan repayment data, that people make repayments right across the earnings distribution, okay? Those in the bottom decile, there's some who make repayments. I'll give you an example. A woman who enters a high earning job immediately after entering university, has a child and never earns above the threshold again. They make a contribution for maybe only 1 or 2 years, but their lifetime earnings are very low, but they make a contribution. And I suspect that it's the differences in the figures are just the way that you simulate, because these are based on simulations, not actual data. We've updated our simulations using much better data. It's the fact that the London economics model is not allowing for the fact that people, just because you're in the 25th percentile of the earnings distribution today, you could be at the bottom tomorrow, or you could move up the top just because of luck and chance. And actually, if you properly model that mobility, the costs of an ICL come down, and you will see that that it's not so stark between the deciles. But this is a minor point, but it is quite important. And what I would argue is that the big problem with the current system is an interest rate. So, and I'm going to come back to that. So I agree with Nick. This is the worst time to cut student places, and we need to provide financial support to all students engaging in vocational and higher education. But I think this necessarily means, in a post-COVID world, making sure it's affordable and equitable, and that means designing ICLs. And I also agree with Nick, it involves reintroducing grants with better designed ICLs. And I think you can show, I know simulations I've done with my model, it's both affordable and much more equitable. So without reform to the interest rate, the suggestions that Nick's making will be highly regressive. So at the moment, the interest rate is 2.6 plus, is RPI plus 3% during university. Then if you are below 27,295, which is the lower, the repayment threshold, it's 0. It just goes up with RPI. Then it's tapered, and then above 49,130, you pay the full RPI plus 3%. However, if you lower the repayment threshold, you will also lower the point where the interest rate taper begins. Okay? And what that means, so the way the government makes money out of the current system is through that interest rate premium. It's much higher than the government cost of borrowing. So if you lower the repayment threshold, it means a lot more poorer students are going to be paying that interest rate premium over their lifetime. And it will mean, I mean, even in Nick's diagram showing the current system, you saw at the top deciles, they pay less. It's because they pay faster and don't have the penalty, don't pay the penalty for as long. However, if you lower the repayment thresholds and don't change the interest rate, you're going to make it much more regressive. I bet it's going to be people in the 3rd and 4th and 5th deciles paying by far the most for university education. So the interest rate, you need to reconsider how you design that. Now, of course, if you're going to reduce the interest rate, which I strongly argue for, you've got to make up the money somewhere. So what I think, and you can show this with the simulations, I'm sure you could show it with the London economics model, is you have to pin the interest rate to the government cost of borrowing, plus some small margin, but below current interest rates that students can get on the labour market. Because another problem with the current system is that high-earning graduates faced with a 5.6% interest rate, who know they're going to be in a really high-paying job for the rest of their lives, get a mortgage, which currently they can get for less than 2% nominal, and pay off their student loan. And the government loses all that bonus revenue. Whereas others who can't have access to that will have to keep on paying this penalty. So what do you do? I think the way to do it, and again, in a paper I did with Nick Barr and Bruce Chapman, who's on this conversation, and Sue Donarski, is it's much better to have a transparent upfront charge for taking out this loan. So, I'm pulling a figure out of my head now, you'd have to model this. But say you have an upfront charge of 20%. If you take out a loan of £40,000, you have an upfront charge of 20%, so £8,000. It's transparent, everybody knows. But the trade-off is that the interest rate that the government charges is lower. And this ensures that the highest earning graduates pay the most. So a high earning graduate who has this 20% upfront charge and pays off their loan in 10 years will pay 120% of the loan value. Nobody else in present value terms will be able to pay more than 120%, but it will mean that it will be progressive. And there's no advantage to a high income student because the interest rate is competitive, but covering the government costs from bailing out. So the government keeps this 20% rent. It won't if you make the changes that Nick is suggesting without careful consideration. So I'm going to give you an example, and this has got nothing to do with my eldest son having started university in 2017, but so a student starting from a high income background in 2017 had fees of $27,750 and maintenance loan of $12,150, right? Students from poorer backgrounds will have a much higher debt than this because they get higher maintenance loans. So a total debt of $39,900. So is anybody willing to provide a guesstimate of what the compound interest accrued on this loan was over the term of his loan? Can anybody tell me? We all know it's RPI plus 3%. I'm sure you all know. Nobody knows, do they? I mean, it's so hard to work out. Can you guess as a percentage or as a sum what it would be? I mean, you know, I talked to David Willits when he was doing this, that he, you know, they knew this was, you know, the way they were going to make money, but it is not transparent. So for my eldest son, it's £4,773.30. So 12% of the loan amount was the compound interest. Now he's been doing a master's out of work for another year, and now his interest only accrues at RPI, so it's gone up by 209.79. But this is, you know, I'm a financially astute economist, and I couldn't work out that, and I think it's not fair or transparent. However, if you charge 20% of the loan amount, it's completely transparent. He would be charged $7,980, then have a lower interest rate, and hopefully, if he does well in the labour market, he will pay the full 120% of his loan value. So it ensures progressivity and ensures the highest earning graduates pay the most and cross-subsidise those who don't do so well at the labour market. And I think you can design a system where it would also pay if you expanded it to vocational education as well. And I think it's completely necessary for vocational education that the repayment threshold is lowered. Now, there's other design things that you can do. You might consider having some sort of piecewise linear repayment rates, starting at 5%, then 9%, and then maybe going higher. There's a paper by Long who suggests this is actually the most progressive way. But there are options, but I do think if we're lowering the repayment threshold, interest rates have to be revisited. And I completely agree with the reintroduction of targeted grants. The cost implications is extremely small if they're well designed. As Nick said, that the reason why they were abolished was not because it was going to save the government much money, it was because of accounting conventions and how it was counted against government debt. That's all been changed now. So that's where I'll end it.
Thanks, Lorraine, and I think that's posed an interesting debate. I'm going to ask Nick to respond to you before we go into the general Q&A, but can I add another question to the question that Lorraine's posed about the politics rather than the economics? I mean, of the three alternatives you discussed, Nick, reducing student numbers, reducing the tuition fee level, or cutting the income threshold on repayments, have different implications politically. Reducing student numbers, saying there are too many university graduates and so on, not popular with higher education aspirant families. I'm sure you're quite right about that. Makes perfect sense, but perhaps has some rhetorical appeal in maybe among those who would have supported the government anyway, but it consolidates that strand of opinion, if you like. But reducing the tuition charge might be very popular with a lot of people. Easy to sell that as a pro-young people reform, will appeal to many current students, you would think. Whereas cutting the income threshold on repayments catches a lot of people quite quickly in terms of additional costs and doesn't seem to have any obvious beneficiaries or people who will celebrate. I agree with your analysis. I agree that's the way to go, but the politics seem to me to be quite difficult. Do you want to respond to me and to respond to Lorraine, and then we'll go into discussion?
Well, yeah, I mean, I want there to be as much time for questions as possible, so I probably won't do either of you justice. But look, I agree with you. The politics are very, very tricky. Equally, when Theresa May put the repayment threshold up from 21,000 to 25,000, it had a very big cost and no political benefit for her at all. So it's not like I'm asking, it's not like if we did row back on the threshold, we're doing something that is radically unheard of. We're going back to the world a little bit more like it was at a time when, let's face it, the country is not as rich as we were hoping the country was going to be. I don't buy the argument, by the way, that cutting student places, I know you weren't really saying this, but some policymakers do, that cutting student places is popular. I think the people in those seats in the north of England that used to vote Labour and now vote Conservative have as high aspirations as the people in cities that have rural areas really, that have always voted Conservative. I mean, Lorraine makes some powerful points, but I think the politics of Lorraine's idea are difficult too. Is Lorraine seriously suggesting, you know, it would be popular to say, take out a loan, and in return for taking out a loan, you're going to have another loan whacked on top up front? I get the arguments for it, but I think the politics of that are difficult as well. And I
agree. I completely agree.
And on the vocational point, I mean, Lorraine's, you know, always very good on this. There is this big outstanding question. So we're putting a bill through the House of Lords currently to, you know, lifetime learning entitlements and all the rest of it. You know, there is this outstanding question whether, you know, I get Lorraine's argument that if people stop doing degrees and do something else instead of a degree, they might not be put off by a loan. I'm not convinced that people who are currently stopping their education at very basic levels, who might choose to continue to go on to do vocational education, will find a loan attractive, because the one bit of the system that we introduced that has not worked, and Claire Callender is the world's greatest living expert on this, is extending the loan rules to part-time students who are debt averse in the way full-time students aren't debt averse. And I suspect some of those potential vocational learners might also be debt averse, because their likely future lifetime earnings are very often, not always, lower.
Can I invite Mike Ratcliffe in at this point?
So Nick has, you know, stolen my thunder there nicely. So I'm interested in the way that the lifelong learning entitlement is going to paint the government into a corner by setting up a series of structures which are going to model on the existing set of arrangements, which have been, you know, predominantly aimed at full-time undergraduate students, but rolled out to part-time as well, and therefore give it itself a really big problem in terms of then trying to think, well, if I'm going to restrict the sector in some way, how am I going to do that? And my subsidiary is that cheeky one about the list of amendments so far put forward for committee stage, which seems to have good cross-party support for rejecting those ideas of who might be limited in getting a lifelong learning entitlement, which in turn might mean who is, you know, not limited in getting a full-time loan. So, you know, Joe Johnson and Lord Watson have both suggested that it shouldn't be ruled out on prior qualification, shouldn't be ruled out on subjects being studied, shouldn't be ruled out in terms of intensity. So if the government's going to find itself painted into, you know, not being able to use any of those things, now I'm sure they'll reject the amendments. But the argument for not restricting people's access to loans on any of those what we in the sector might consider spurious grounds, I think is going to be powerfully made over the next couple of weeks.
Can I comment on, Simon, you were mentioning changing fees, okay? But it crucially depends on how it's done, okay? So remember when we put fees up to £9,000, it was all about, you know, we're going to create a market and some people would charge less. However, places were capped. So universities, you know, there was a queue to go to university. So it was completely obvious from economics that everybody would go up to £9,000. But interestingly, I think the idea, and Bruce might be able to talk about this in Australia, they're changing fees and putting fees up for humanities because they want people not to study. You know, they want us, you know, and they're making science cheaper because they want to switch people from, you know, low value humanities courses to high value. But people forget it's not just demand, it's supply. And you've got to see what happens at universities. And what happened because of the 2012 reforms was, for universities, it was the cheap, popular courses, which now had a huge boost in funding, up to 40% increase in funding, which expanded. And actually, STEM courses, where the margins changed very little, you know, got much less funding. So now you have a proliferation of low-cost business courses. And it's not because necessarily the demand's there, it's because it pays university to, you know, have more of these courses because that allows them to cross-subsidize other students. So it's not just supply, it's demand. So if you're going to cut fees, it really depends on how much, it's not just, you know, whether that will change students' choices. It really depends on how much money universities are going to receive, whether there's going to be any top up from government. So you've got to look at both demand and supply. And in all the reforms that I know of that happen internationally, the behaviour is being governed by universities, not by student choice.
Colleagues, we've only got a few minutes left, and the student financing experts in this group need to indicate to me through the chat that they want to come into the discussion. Our next question is from Edward Hicks.
Yes, thank you. I thought sort of two related questions. Firstly, going back to Nick's table of sort of measuring quality, I'm wondering, why does he think that teaching intensity, which would seem, to my mind, quite a good metric, has never really taken off, in being a sort of combination of partly contact hours, but partly sort of women's class sizes? And secondly, with Lorraine, I suppose the issue with the other issue I'd have thought with your proposal of a loan charge is some people would presumably just avoid taking out a student loan at all. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that aspect.
Do you want me to come in, Simon? Oh, sorry.
Oh, Nick, you go first.
Well, Edward always asks very penetrating questions. And Edward, the short answer is I don't know. I like teaching intensity measures. I think they're better than some of the alternatives. And I wish they took off. I mean, I actually took a paper on teaching intensity to my own advisory board. My own advisory board turned it, wasn't written by me, but they turned it down. They didn't think it was a sufficiently interesting area of study. I happen to disagree with that. I'm very intrigued to know Lorraine's answer to your second question, because I'm also interested in that.
Well, I mean, with the current system, effectively, there is a percentage charge. Who knows what it is? You know, for my son, it was 11%. For a poor student, it will actually be more because the compound interest rate is more. But the important thing is explaining it's an income contingent loan. So there is this 20% charge. However, you will only pay it if you happen to be one of the high earning graduates who repays their loan in full. If you have bad luck, you have years out of the labour market, you will, more than likely pay less than the value of the loan. The whole point is that the income contingent loan offers insurance. And what it does is it makes sure that university is free at the point of access. And how much you pay depends on how well you do in the labour market. The repayment is small compared to taxation. So, I think there is an explanation, I think there is a problem in perception and people not understanding the loan system, but it should not stop people from going. Whether it does or not, of course, is an open question, but it should not. And what I'm proposing is by far the most progressive. It ensures that those who do well, the best, pay the most, whereas the current system, it is not progressive.
Bruce Chapman.
Thank you, Simon. There's much I have to agree with in this discussion. I'll just make a comment or two on the things that I think are really, really important. And the most important of these, I think, is the interest rate issue. And Lorraine's modelling has convinced me and anyone in this area who's into the technical side that it's extremely regressive the way the interest rates are now organised. And Lorraine talks about the prospect. She labelled it an upfront charge. It has to be understood that it's not an upfront charge, it's an addition to the debt. So nobody has to pay anything upfront. It's just a language issue. Lorraine knows this. It's by far the most equitable way to go. We started in the Australian system, which is a bit like the English system, although not as weird. There was a discount for an upfront payment when it was first introduced, and that was about 20%. And that effectively did the same thing. So the discount for an upfront payment is effectively the 20% charge, which takes the place of highly regressive interest rate regimes, which are currently the case in the UK. That's extremely important, I think, to this debate. But if you want to get the money back quicker, cutting the first income threshold of repayment is not all that kind of pretty, not all that nice in a way, but you've got to get more back from the ones above the first income threshold. You can either increase the marginal rates, and I think there's a case for that, or you could do what is done in Australia, where the debt is taken as a percentage of total income. You can iron out the wrinkles in that so that there are no behavioural effects. But that's where this debate's got to be. If there's one thing I've got to say, it's the interest rate regimes are completely important to this. You can make more money with the type of surcharge that Lorraine's talking about. Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm not sure whether our speakers want to comment. I'm happy to bring in, Nick does, yes.
Yeah, just one very quick thing, because there is this assumption that the interest rate is a woeful part of the system. Let's remember, the only people who repay the interest are the graduates who get close to extinguishing their loan, number one. And number two, let's not also forget that there are a bunch of student unions in the UK at the moment who are campaigning to have the interest rate significantly increased, because they regard that as making the system more progressive.
But that's just wrong. It's wrong. If it's above the government cost of borrowing, and if the outside market options in terms of interest rates are lower,
But my point is, where is the centre of this debate? Because the centre of this debate outside this webinar is different to the centre of the debate in this webinar. They are out lobbying politicians for it as we speak. And the other thing we need to remember, I think, is if we make the system, it's already pretty progressive, the system, if we make
but it won't be if you lower the threshold, it will become less progressive.
Well, that's a fair point, and I'm not arguing for, as I say, I wouldn't, I want more money spent on education, not less, but we need to make sure the government doesn't go down routes that are even worse than other routes they might be willing to accept. I'll stop there so other people.
Yeah, what I'd like to do now is bring in a couple of people to make comments, and then give Nick and Lorraine the final response. And I've got three people. One is Claire Callender. Claire, would you like to say something at this point?
Yes, I agree with your comment, Simon, that the politics of things are such whereby I think the most attractive would be actually reducing tuition fees. But we've been doing some research looking at the longer term consequences of student loan debt on graduates. And what it's showing is some really very interesting stuff. Firstly, about how certain features of the loan system are very good insofar as limiting the overall behavioural impact on loans on graduates' lives. However, if we go down and look at issues around, for example, how do graduates regard interest rates, on the whole, it's very negatively perceived. And Nick, while I know on paper that students aren't repaying that interest until after they've paid off the principal, in reality, when they get their yearly statement, what they see in front of them is no reduction or limited reduction in their overall level of debt, or indeed their debt levels, including the interest, actually going up, which is incredibly, incredibly dispiriting. They don't understand the system. They didn't understand it when they took them out. They don't understand it now. The very high proportion of the students, or good proportion of the students, the graduates, I beg your pardon, who we've interviewed, don't even know how much they owe. They certainly don't understand how their repayments work, and they certainly don't understand the interest rates. So I would be really concerned in terms of those who actually are most affected, i.e. the graduates, and how they will react to changes. And somebody else picked up on Sharia compliant loans. That is incredibly important. I mean, we have some examples of Muslim students who are doing everything that is totally and utterly economically irrational, i.e. they start even paying off their loans while they're studying, because actually they don't, I know, Lorraine, it's not a rational thing to be doing according to the thinking behind the loan system. But they want to get rid of the interest, and they want to get rid of their loans as soon as possible. And this is having a radical impact on their behaviour.
Well, with the interest rates at the levels they are, I mean, it is rational for some people to pay that quickly, because
but they're not high earners.
But most it's not. Most it's not. But for some it's definitely.
Yeah. You're on mute, Simon.
Thanks, Claire. That's the first time for this week. I'm going to bring in Gordon McKenzie and then Keris Cooper, and then ask Lorraine and then finally Nick to respond. Gordon.
Thank you, Simon. It was just a sort of brief comment, really, that in my view, the core of the Auger proposals of reducing the headline fee and putting more money into teaching grant is entirely sensible policy. And I have sort of thought that both in 2012 and then again in 2015, Treasury insistence on putting more and more money into grant, pushing it into fees, pushing it into loans, pushing it so high, kind of pushed the system to breaking point. And what interests me is that so many of us then reject the Auger view because we believe that once again, Treasury would mess it up by refusing to fund that extra grant and would thus destabilise the system. But that's just the comment. Thank you.
And finally, Keris.
Thank you. Well, Claire has already very articulately summarised a lot of our emergent findings. No, you did a really good job already. I think probably just to add a little more detail as well, related to how graduates that have been interviewed feel about the interest. We do have examples of where graduates have the means to this kind of incentivizing them and then managing to or planning to pay off their loans early with money that they've been given from relatives where possible. And for other graduates, a lot of them actually talk about the kind of futility in even trying to make any repayments when the repayments they're making don't even, the interest that's being added is greater than the repayments they're making anyway. Some of them describe starting off with this intention to make repayments and feel good about paying back their loan, and then realizing that, they're kind of fighting a losing battle, and that is largely comes down to the interest. It's one of the things that people talk about most in these interviews. So that's all that I would add to what Claire has already said.
Thank you.
Lorraine and then Nick. Lorraine.
I think I've said most of what I've said. I think there's quite a lot of merit in thinking about reducing fees and having, sensible top-ups by government. It gives, of course, it depends on how it's done. But part of the reason for increasing fees and not having direct grants to universities again was for the fiscal reasons Nick mentioned. Whereas now, I think in accounting terms, it would make very little difference. For a lot of students, it would make absolutely no difference, right? So they're not going to pay off their loan whether the fees are 7.5 or whether they're 9 to 50. And therefore, psychologically, it might be quite important in terms of decision making, and it will make very little difference to government revenue. It depends on what subjects they do, and there's lots of issues. But I think there is merit in revisiting the fees. And in Australia, they've got an interesting hybrid system where it's, there's some high cost, but shortage disciplines like nursing, where they have low fees, very low fees and high government top up. And then there's other cheap subjects like law and economics, where they have very high fees because they're popular and low government subsidies. It seems like, a hybrid that sort of looks at both supply and demand issues is something that's potentially worth considering.
Nick.
Well, thank you, Simon. It's been a very stimulating hour. I'd just like to make 3 points that I don't think have been made so far. First of all, there seems to have been a bit of an assumption in this conversation that for some people, repaying their loans early makes a lot of sense, if only in financial terms. I'm not completely convinced about that. One of the reasons that student loan systems work so well is because they have things like inbuilt life insurance. If you die or you can't get a well-paid job, you never pay any of it back. So if you get a well-paid job immediately after leaving university and overpay, you may very well regret that. My best friend at university has multiple sclerosis, has never been able to hold down a well-paid job. If he had repaid his loan, or his parents had repaid his loan for him, that would have been a very poor financial deal, because it's one of the progressive features of student loan systems. It's things like inbuilt life insurance. Secondly, interest rates. Look, you only pay that you don't pay, but you only accrue interest of 5.6%, as Lorraine said in her slides, if you're on a very high salary. other than during the period of study. So most people don't understand that. People complain a lot about the high interest rate. So the first thing I would do would be not abolish the high interest rate. It would be explain the high interest rate, which again is one of the progressive features, and see if then people have more understanding of what's happening. And then finally, and in a way I'm arguing against my own slides here, but I think it's really important that when we put up those decile charts showing who benefits, who loses, who pays the most, we are only talking about graduates. So those are decile charts for only 50% of the population. And if we're really going to have a broader conversation about who should fund higher education, well, the other 50% matters too. And of course, all our modelling is about how much taxpayers in general should contribute. And so we mustn't get too caught up on the deciles. We must also think about what the government overall can afford relative to its other educational priorities and its other priorities. And other than that, Simon, thank you for letting me do this. It's been an honour to be able to speak in front of some of the people you've got on this call, from whom I've learned so much, and I hope these conversations will continue.
Yeah, I feel the same about it too, Nick. And
Yes,
I mean, I've got three abiding thoughts, really, the conclusion of that. One is that the tuition loan system that Bruce designed is in 1988 or thereabouts is so important as a system of student financing. And what the UK does really matters globally. It's still a major cultural exemplar and a policy influence across the world in terms of highly developed and successful systems. And tuition loans have, by and large, in this country, worked pretty well to finance an expansion in a more equitable way than any alternative system would have done. And that's what they do. And that's what we want them to do everywhere. We want the United States to do this as well, as in the way the UK has, and so on. So if the UK regresses and drops this system or makes it unworkable in terms of its current benefits, such as the life insurance that Nick talks about, it'll be an enormous defeat for student financing, for higher education, for universal participation principle. So it's really important that we get through this period in the UK successfully. So my second thought is that the 33% RAB charge on Nick's options looks very important. Getting the RAB charge down to that extent is really crucial. However we do it, that in itself is a really important objective in terms of sustainability of the scheme. It's the only thing that perhaps that matters most in terms of the politics and the economics. And so, Nick, we're really indebted to you to creating a debate which has allowed us to think about that sustainability in a serious way. The third thing I've got reviewed from what Lorraine said, the importance of a system which is more simple than the one we have, if it's going to be politically sustainable long term. I think the temptation to create a lot of different levers and ways in which it can be tweaked and year by year and managed in terms of its total costs and so on, short and long term, is always going to be there. But if we had a system which anyone could figure out, as well as they can figure out a mortgage on a home, it would really help us, I think, in the politics of the tuition loan system. And at the moment, the system is too opaque, it really needs a redesign for that reason alone. Colleagues, look, thank you very, very much. It's been wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about these things properly, and the recording of this session will be a useful resource. The debate goes on in the UK in the next 2-3 months. Really important time, and very important that everyone gets involved in it, I think. Our next webinar is tomorrow, and it's a different kind of webinar. It's taking us into how COVID-19 has affected the way we see and understand academic work, and a group of colleagues from Finland who are giving up their Finnish summer, which begins earlier than the summer in many other higher education systems, to lead the webinar. Melina Arnikuviu, Terry Nokala, who's a colleague of mine on the Journal of Higher Education, and Taina Saarinen will speak to us about rethinking times and spaces of academic work as a result of COVID-19. So there will be an interesting, theorised but contemporary, COVID-19 related discussion. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Once again, Nick and Lorraine, very, very grateful to you for your contributions at short notice today. Well done.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks, Lorraine. Thanks,